As you could probably guess by the fact that I've made 8 countdowns based on this topic, I freaking love boss battles. And really, who doesn't? Boss battles are pretty much the ultimate test of your skills as you progress through a game. Everyone has their select choice of favorite bosses, and now I'm here to present mine. Now I know what you're thinking. You already did a favorite bosses list. Why are you doing another one? Well, for 3 reasons. 1, it's severely outdated. 2, I included a final boss on a primarily normal boss list. And 3, because I can, darn it! Now for the ground rules. Other than the 1 per franchise and play before put rules, I'm also excluding all final bosses from this list. That will be its own list soon enough. Also, note that these are my favorite boss battles, not the best, as that's entirely subjective. Thirdly, bosses on this list shall not be judged by their difficulty. As long as I enjoyed the fight, it'll be on here. Finally, there will be spoilers, so you have been warned. And on that note, let us commence! When people think of the most iconic characters in the Castlevania series, they'll usually say Dracula, or Alucard, or one of the Belmonts. And while those characters do come to mind, one of the first characters I would mention is Dracula's most loyal servant, Death. This powerful Reaper has appeared in pretty much every single Castlevania game, and has had some very memorable battles. And to start off this list, we find ourselves at Dracula X Chronicles. Now in this game, you actually fight Death twice. You first fight him in the prologue stage, but the battle only lasts a few seconds before he flies off. However, it's later on the Ghost Ship stage when the real Death battle begins. In this battle, Death will begin by summoning miniature sickles to home in on you, and will only use this attack until he has half of his health left. Then he'll go into the background and launch giant skulls at you before entering a combat form complete with his signature scythe. At this point, Death will continue to shoot sickles, but will also perform scythe combos and even a mid-air spin attack. It's a relatively challenging fight, but with the right sub-weapon, it can actually end quite quickly, hence why it's lower. However, whenever I go through Dracula X Chronicles, I always anticipate this epic Death, but I mean battle with Death. Man, that was close. You know what game I need to talk about more? Bomberman 64. Honestly, the last time I talked about it was back in 2013 with... Oh my goodness, get away from me! But I digress. Despite its very large exception, Bomberman 64's boss fights are actually quite well done. And while I could easily pick any of the monster bosses, my favorites have always been the battles against Altair's henchmen, most notably, Regulus. This battle is what I like to classify as the rival duel, in which 2 opponents of equal capabilities and skill duke it out one-on-one. And while this is definitely not the last rival duel on this list, it's definitely a prime example on why I like this trope. In this battle, Regulus only uses 2 attacks, bombs, and a charge attack that can stun you. It may not seem like much, but when you compare it to Artemis's instant kill fire arrows and Orion's Sonic Blast, it's definitely welcomed with open arms in my book. It's a pretty fun fight, and while it's not super hard, it makes up for it with the challenge of earning all 5 gold cards during the battle. And it's a good thing that Bomberman lets Regulus live, otherwise that final battle with Sirius would be a lot harder. Oh yeah, Sirius is the final boss. I want to say spoiler alert, but the game's almost 20 years old now, no one's gonna care. Let's talk about Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. If you haven't played this GameCube cult classic, you really are missing out. While the concept of a platformer where the controller is a pair of bongos is admittedly really strange, it's actually one of the best platformers Nintendo has made, and it also provides some extremely fun, albeit constantly repeated, boss fights. And the truly standout bosses in this game are the fist fights with the evil Kong Kings, with my personal favorite being the afro-headed Ninja Kong, who by the way is not at all ninja because logic is not in Nintendo's dictionary. If there's one thing I love about this battle more than the others, it's how intense it is. The battle takes place on a cliff in the middle of a thunderous rainstorm, and this fight is without a doubt the most fast-paced out of any of the Kong fights up to this point. And before any of you mention Sumo Kong, guess who hasn't gotten that far yet? Seriously, getting enough beats for all those crests is easier said than done. In this fight, timing is a necessity. Ninja Kong's attacks are exceedingly fast and demand for a near-perfect reaction time. However, because of how far you are in the game at this point, it should be natural instinct to go that fast. It's a nice challenge and a truly epic boss fight. And one more thing to mention, that's rain effect on the fighters. There's a reason why people consider Jungle Beat to be the single best looking game on the entire GameCube. One thing I forgot to mention during my overlooked games countdown is that alongside the epic gameplay and well-designed roster, Sengoku Basara Samurai Heroes also has some really fun boss fights. Or at least, for the most part. There are those occasional meh fights like Soren de Tomo, but there are some awesome fights like Yoshiaki Mogami. And this variation of boss fights is shown best in the Siege of Karasu Castle stage, in which 2 routes are given to the player. On one route, you can fight Hideaki Kobayakawa, the gluttonous coward who, to be honest, has the absolute worst battle in the game. But on the other route, you've got Tenkai.
I know what you've come here to ask. You want to know more about me. You want to find out who I am and what I'm looking for. I am Tenkai, the Harbinger of Death, and I will answer all your questions.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I would pick the battle against Tenkai over the fight against Hideaki any day. But there's more behind why I like this fight, not just his design, weapon, and voice. He's one of the only bosses that's just a straight-up one-on-one duel. Every other boss has either some sort of gimmick or other soldiers to fight. While with Tenkai, you fight him and no one else, which in all honesty is really cool. But don't you dare underestimate this Reaper. If you get caught in one of Tenkai's combos, it can be quite devastating. Overall, I just found this battle to be one of the most enjoyable in the game, and definitely a better pick than Hideaki. But you wanna know what's even better? In the game's re-release, Sengoku Basara 3 Utage, Tenkai was made a playable character! Yes! Yes! Too bad Utage was Japan exclusive. I know. Tragic. Question time! What would happen if you took Cloud Strife, but replaced his Buster Sword with a Pokeball? Quite simple. You'd get Volkner. Out of all the gym leaders in the Pokemon series, Volkner, the electric gym leader from Diamond and Pearl, has always been my personal favorite, and for a multitude of reasons. For starters, Volkner is one of the more interesting gym leaders. He's become depressed from a lack of challenging opponents and has spent his free time renovating his gym, which has put a strain on Sunnyshore's city's power supply. For example, the gym's electrical gear puzzle was actually made by Volkner solely out of boredom. Wow, that's the greatest solution to boredom I've ever heard of. However, once you beat Volkner, he bursts into insane laughter from the sheer enjoyment you provided in that fight, fixing him of his depression. But now, let's talk about his actual boss fight. Volkner has 4 Pokemon on his team, a Raichu, an Ambipom, an Octillery, and a Luxray. Yeah, the inclusions of Ambipom and Octillery were admittedly kinda strange, but I digress. Other than this odd choice, the battle itself is quite fun, and, depending on your team, can be quite a challenge. But it's also satisfying to earn that final badge upon Volkner's defeat. Now before you ask why I included the Diamond and Pearl version of the boss battle and not the Platinum version, well, to put it simply, I've yet to play Platinum. Is that a problem? If there's one thing I will admit that Rhythm Thief isn't the absolute greatest at, it's their characters. I mean, it's got some fantastic characters like Phantom R, Inspector Vergier, Charlie, and Napoleon, but on the other hand, there's Jean-Francois. Now when you first meet him, he seems like a pretty nice guy. That is until he appears at the Eiffel Tower, shoots you, and then gives the Dragon Crown to Napoleon. From that point on, you desperately want revenge on that backstabbing monster, and once you get to the Hanging Gardens, you get to fight him. And man, it's amazing!
Would you like to see what this weapon can do, Phantom R?
There's a lot to be enjoyed about this battle. For starters, the fight itself plays like the most intense match of Simon Says, as Jean-Francois will shoot crystals at you and you have to counter them in the same rhythm as he fires them. While this is a very simplistic system for a boss fight and admittedly rather easy, everything else in this fight makes up for it, ranging from the magma chamber setting to the music, which fuses box, fugue, and G minor with electric guitar! And not to mention, the dialogue between Phantom R and Jean-Francois is some of the best in the entire game.
But this weapon is invincible.
Sorry, but it's very invincible.
Despite the easy factor of this battle, it's all worth it to take out that dirty traitor. Though am I the only one who notices the immense amount of similarities between this and the Egg Emperor? Not only the design, but listen to Jean-Francois' battle quotes.
Keep this.
Sound familiar? As you may have been able to figure it out recently, I love Fire Emblem Awakening. I mean, there's a reason it's my all-time favorite game at this point. However, if there's one thing that I will admit this game's not the most prominent for, it's the boss fights. They're not bad, far from it, but with how the combat system works in the Fire Emblem games, bosses aren't really the first priority in-game. Because of this, most boss fights in the series are memorable because of the character you're actually fighting. Such is the case with my choice from Awakening. But before I get to the actual boss, I need to put you guys in context. Oh, and by the way, don't take that spoiler warning lightly. Early on in the game, the Mad King of Plegia, Gangrel, wages war against the nation of Elis, the kingdom that your army fights for, and kidnaps Elis' ruler, the Exalt Emrin, who so happens to be Chrom and Lissa's older sister. After trapping Chrom and the shepherds right where he wants them, Gangrel demands them to hand over the Fire Emblem or Emrin will die. However, no matter which choice you pick, Emrin decides to take matter in her own hands and try to talk some sense into Gangrel and his forces. When it appears not to work, Emrin makes the ultimate sacrifice.
Chrom, Lissa, and all my people know that I loved you.
Although Gangrel heartlessly mocks her sacrifice as a waste and no one will even bat an eye at it, the following chapter proves him entirely wrong, which leads me to my choice for the best normal boss in Awakening, Mustafa. Going into this fight, you're already struck by the fact that Emrin died, but her sacrifice becomes that much more powerful when you realize that the Plegian forces, including Mustafa, are starting to have second thoughts about the war. This is what makes this boss fight such a fantastic one. The battle itself plays like every other boss in the game, but it's the atmosphere and the boss himself that makes it so memorable. Well, that and the music. The song that plays during this chapter, entitled Don't Speak Her Name, is one of the best tracks in Awakening, and one of my favorite songs in video game history. And it's one of the few songs in the game that doesn't have an ablazed version, meaning that the song plays even during battle. The last thing to make note of for this boss fight is that it's the first chapter of the game where the mission is to solely defeat the commander, not the entire army. That's because when Mustafa is slain, he uses his final breath to ask for his remaining men to be spared. Seriously, why wasn't Mustafa added as one of the spot pass units? I would have loved to have this guy in my army. But I digress. As bosses in Awakening go, Mustafa's easily one of the game's best. And while the battle with Gangrel in the following chapter was a close honorable mention, Mustafa beats out the Mad King just by a bit. Seriously though, that Gangrel fight is pretty satisfying.